If you've been paying attention in history class, you've probably heard about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing. These two events were the first time nuclear bombs had been deployed, and these bombs ultimately put an end to World War II and saved a lot of American soldiers from fighting near Japan. But unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of Japanese men, women, and children had to pay with their dignity, health, and even lives. But out of this chain of events, we got one of the most unbelievable survivor stories ever told, when an unremarkable man survived hell twice. Yamaguchi was born on March 16, 1916 in Nagasaki, Japan. In the 1930s, Yamaguchi joined Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and worked as a draftsman designing oil tankers. On the morning of December 6, 1941, Japan launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the next day the US declared war.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Like many people in Japan, Yamaguchi was never a supporter of the Japanese Empire. In fact, he even thought about honor killing his family with an overdose of sleeping pills before killing himself, if Japan ever lost the war. But it never came to that point. Yamaguchi was just a normal person caught in a crazy world, just like everyone else in Japan at the time. In the summer of 1945, Yamaguchi was on a 3-month business trip in Hiroshima for Mitsubishi. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Yamaguchi was preparing to leave with his colleagues for Nagasaki when he realized that he forgot his hank, which is an identification card used in Japan. He was heading back to the docks when at 8:15 a.m. the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the Little Boy nuclear bomb on the city. He was only 3 miles from ground zero when the bomb detonated. He ended up getting radiation burns and his left ear ruptured. He was also temporarily blinded. He blacked out for a little bit before waking up and crawling to an air raid shelter, and afterwards he located his friends and brought them to the air raid shelter. Later in an interview he said, "I have walked and crawled through the bottom of hell. I should be dead, but it was my fate to keep on living." After getting patched up, he decided to go to Nagasaki the next day. When he came to his boss's office, he described what happened in Hiroshima and said that the entire city was destroyed by one bomb. The boss, not believing his story, said that he was crazy. Immediately afterwards, an explosion took place 3 miles from the office. It was the Fat Man bomb that was dropped from another B-29 bomber. Despite this, he still survived and was unharmed from the explosion. After the Nagasaki bombing and the declaration of war on Japan by the Soviets, they ultimately decided to surrender to the United States. And so, on the 15th of August 1945, Japan surrendered to the United States. After the bombings, Yamaguchi became a translator in the newly occupied Allied Japan. In the 1950s, he and his wife, who was a survivor of the Nagasaki bombing, had 2 children. He ended up going back to his work at Mitsubishi. In 1957, the Japanese government began to officially recognize survivors of the 2 bombings as hibakushas. But here's the frustrating thing. Yamaguchi only got hibakusha ID for the Nagasaki bombing and not for Hiroshima. Despite this, he was content with this and put his experiences behind him. But as the years went by, his opinions on nuclear bombs began to change. When he was in his 80s, he wrote a book about his experiences as well as a book of poetry. He ended up taking part in a 2006 documentary dedicated to the survivors of the horrific attacks. This documentary was later screened at a United Nations meeting where he directly pleaded to the nations to abolish nuclear weapons. Later in an interview, he stated, "The reason that I hate the atomic bomb is because of what it does to the dignity of human beings. I can't understand why the world cannot understand the agony of the nuclear bombs. How can they keep developing these weapons?" He later stated that the only ones who should be allowed to govern these countries with nuclear weapons are mothers who have to feed their babies. Eventually, he thought surviving was his destiny, and so in January 2009, he applied for double hibakusha status, which was accepted by the government in March 2009. Which means he is currently the only officially recognized double hibakusha. He stated, "My double radiation exposure is now an official government record. It can tell the younger generation the horrifying history of the atomic bombs, even after I die." Well, sadly, he got diagnosed with stomach cancer in 2009, and on January 4th, 2010, he died at the age of 93, ending the amazing story of an unremarkable man. It suffices to say that the bombings have largely receded into history. But what many don't know is the horrors of the bombings. Most of you guys most likely haven't experienced the bombings. But don't forget that behind these two mushroom clouds are regular people dying in agony and pain. Remember that many people in Japan didn't want the war but didn't speak up in fear of the military. And they had to pay the ultimate price, despite being the innocent ones. In war, there are no winners or losers, only survivors. Nowadays, about 120,000 survivors of the bombs are alive. Many of them saw hell with their very own eyes, just like Yamaguchi did. Let his story serve as a reminder that nuclear bombs aren't the spectacle that you see in movies and television shows. They're real-life weapons of mass destruction that can kill millions of people in one explosion. Luckily, ever since the Cold War, the nuclear arsenal has decreased to a point where humanity could survive a nuclear war. Although in such war, billions would still die, it's still more preferable to the complete extinction of humanity. And now the effects of nuclear radiation are more understood ever since the Chernobyl disaster. But it's important that we continue to tell the tales of the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. This was just one of many tales. This tale was about a man who survived hell twice.
Мы наблюдали это с расстояния 70 километров. Какое-то количество людей находилось ближе.